Hello. So it's the graveyard shift, and I'm going to try and keep you entertained. Stella, I'm going to relate a story and do some storytelling, but I'm not sure it's what you had in mind. With this mood lighting, I hope I don't put you to sleep, so you'll tell me if I deserve a badge after this. Just to preface it by saying that I've always done talks and presentations guided by PowerPoints, and this time I'm going back to a script because stories can go off in such tangents that you lose the focus of what you're going to be saying. And I'm hoping that some of the points I raise and share with you will resonate with you and it'll lead to some critical thinking and imagination about open recognition. So let me start by thanking all of you for this opportunity to share my thoughts and views in this keynote on this fascinating topic of learning and recognition. You have no idea how delighted I was to be invited to be here with like-minded people who believe in the social justice principles of inclusivity and opening up the recognition of learning. But before I start, I must preface it with a confession that until last year, when Dawn contacted me on LinkedIn, I did not even know there was an open recognition community of practice, nor that you gathered annually for the last 20 years, you said, Serge, or more? 20 plus years at these epic events. I have very little engagement with social media platforms, so it was quite by chance and after some prodding that I picked up Dawn's LinkedIn message. Also, at the beginning, I was very wary of Dawn because in his introductory message, he was quoting verbatim various comments I'd made in international platforms. And it made me wonder, who was this person who was following me around virtually and then quoting things that I didn't even remember having said at these conferences? But anyhow, I was glad I followed through and responded, and then had the pleasure of connecting with Serge, and then more recently with Simone at a conference in Jordan a few weeks ago. And as I learned more about this groundbreaking work on open recognition that is being done by Serge and others in this community, I felt like I had been living in a parallel universe at the bottom of Africa, because so much of what I thought, said, and felt about learning and recognition resonated with their thinking. So just to, before I go into my storytelling, I want to tell you that I'm a firm believer that the opening up of recognition of all learning credentials matter, and especially that which is derived through non-formal, informal learning pathways, and I want to tell you why. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about myself, so that's where the storytelling comes in. Because I believe that who I am and my own lifelong journey and lived experiences have deeply influenced my research inquiries, my thinking, my views, and is the reason why I am so deeply passionate about looking at the social justice and transformative aspects of individual agency and access to the recognition of learning credentials. I am a third-generation Gerd child of immigrant, indentured, essentially a form of slavery, East Indian laborers duped by a British colonial government to leave their ancestral homes in India and to journey in the late 1800s by sea to Port Natal in South Africa to work on the sugarcane plantations. My grandparents and their indentured ancestors lived in circumstances of abject poverty and subjugation. I don't want you to feel sorry for me, but just to tell you this is where I came from and it's influenced my thinking. They were considered units of cheap labor. They were deliberately denied access to formal education and did not have the skills to write or read, in both their home language and the dominant colonial language of English. Now, although my parents had access to minimal grade school education and learned the basic skills of reading and writing, it was only in English and not in the language spoken in their homes or broader community. However, what I experienced for my family and the community I lived growing up is that despite no or limited formal education and literacy skills, there were many talented, highly skilled, and somewhat ingenious people, like my grandparents, who used indigenous knowledge to heal the sick and source and creatively prepare food for large extended families, despite their circumstances of limited income. Also, I learned that many of my family and community members were some of the most accomplished and recognized people in their practices, trades, and occupations. They had used their self-taught knowledge and skills, learned through informal and non-formal pathways, to build successful careers and livelihoods, and to gain recognition for the excellence of their skills and work. Added to this, I experienced firsthand in my growing up years the systematic oppression and deliberate undermining that is caused by a perverted system of colonialism, racial segregation, and patriarchy. Last November, and after 40 years of working in the education and training space, I retired from my formal job as the CEO of the South African Qualifications Authority. I just gave you away my age, and I think it's suddenly to find yourself one of the oldest people in the room is a kind of a revelation. But anyway, this gave me time to refire my passion and to look more deeply into why I continue to be a card-carrying advocate of finding new and innovative ways of opening up the recognition of learning from a transformative, social justice, and the safeguarding of personal agency perspectives. So why am I telling you all of this? It is because I believe that my background and life journey in a historically colonial context and the most recent discourses around decolonization, I think it's in the program, some people are talking about it in the next few days, has also made me more critically aware and questioning of what words mean and how the spoken and written dominant languages of assumed knowledge creation and approaches to assessment and recognition is used to exclude rather than include marginalized individuals and communities. What also influenced my thinking was my postgraduate studies in the US in the 1980s. I went from being a labor relations activist to studying adult learning and literacy. I was greatly influenced by the philosophy and writings of Paulo Freire and his seminal work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which focused on instilling in marginalized and disadvantaged people their own potential to change themselves and their spaces. The emancipatory and transformative adult education campaigns in Brazil, Guinea-Bissau, and Cuba inspired me. What really spoke to me, especially from the Cuban campaign, was how the Freirean philosophy and principles were used to level out the power relations between the young school-going literacy facilitators and the mostly rural communities where the programs were being implemented. During the day, these facilitators worked alongside their adult learners and learned about agriculture and manual work. And in the evening, taught adults to read and write. These words of Freire, okay, now I have to go to the slide, I have to be ambidextrous. Okay. These words of Freire, reading the world comes before reading the word. It really struck me, and I became interested in learning more about how adults who cannot read and write learn life coping skills and competencies to navigate their world and livelihoods. I spoke to many people, including my grandfather, who performed complicated engineering-related functions at the sugar mill factory where he worked, and was oftentimes called upon at all hours during the night by his white supervisor to fix or reset faulty machinery. Also, I was quite puzzled about how he had managed to play a complicated card game that required a high level of numeracy without formal schooling. Part of this puzzle was solved when I interviewed a brilliant and sought-after young electrician in Zimbabwe, who, although he never learned to read or write, described how he takes pictures of things in his mind. This, he said, became his compass to construct and navigate his world. He went on to explain that in spite of not being able to distinguish the individual components of written words or numbers, he was able to tell when the picture is altered or different. I realized then that we who are literate and numerate read the letters of the alphabet that make up the word almost intuitively and unconsciously, while people who are illiterate read their word in pictures, what Freire refers to as reading the world. So in the 1990s, when I returned to South Africa, I got very involved in adult literacy programs and the emerging recognition of prior learning movement, which was actually started in my country by the labor unions. They sought to get recognition for their members, the majority of whom had either no schooling or minimal literacy and numeric education. These were very heady days for us South Africans, as we miraculously transitioned to a democratic country through negotiations and not a civil war as widely expected. Interestingly, and Don asked me to talk about this, the first piece of transformative legislation published by the first democratically elected Mandela-led government of 1994 was the South African Qualifications Authority Act of 1995, which established, I'll call it SAQA, the Qualifications Authority, to design a national qualifications framework. I think we were one of the first generation framework developers in terms of qualification framework. It was envisaged that this framework would start to integrate and transition a fractured, we had 17 education departments. So this fractured, discriminatory and unequal education and training system, which was based solely on race, and this was a very tall ask indeed. So after 30 years, I am pleased to say that the qualifications framework that we developed and implemented is deeply entrenched into our transformed education and training system and structures, although it's still very much a developmental work in progress. So the South African NQF is pitched as a relational construct, and a key priority in its early development was a policy to recognize prior learning. And this was first published in 2012. This policy has evolved over the years and is premised on formally recognizing prior learning and is premised on access and credits. So I'll let you read that. But I think it's important to say about, Serge, you raised earlier about making learning visible and recognizing it. The UNESCO, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are also for 2030. They also talk about making non-formal and informal learning visible and bringing in recognition instruments. So they have gone quite a way. And also very interesting, I was sharing with some colleagues during the break, UNESCO realized that we are going down this pathway of writing sort of qualifications as job descriptions, I call it in South Africa. And So the components or the learning criteria, usually it's know, do, understand, right? But now it's know, do, to live in a community, and the last one, which I think for me is most important, to be. What does it mean being a citizen? What does it mean being part of a community? Education and qualifications are not just to prepare you for careers. Thank you. So RPL in South Africa has been practiced and studied extensively over the years and described as presenting pockets of excellence in giving voice to and recognition to the non-formal and informally learned skills and competencies of high-performing and achieving individuals in workplaces who have been denied access to formal qualifications and certification. I spent the last 10 years of my formal working career with the Qualifications Authority, but as an adult educator, looked at finding ways to make all forms of non-formal and informal learning visible so that it can be recognized by our education and training system. What really challenged me and I took issue with is the fact that the assessment for recognizing prior learning was invariably written portfolios of evidence. And in the case of trades, a trade test. Now, can you imagine somebody with no or minimal schooling? Just the word test is a daunting thing to be facing. To me, I felt that the policies and procedures that underpin the recognition of prior learning and its practice kept people out rather than brought people in. And whenever I look at education policies, that is my gauge. Is it meant to keep people out or to bring people in? And I do believe the formal academy and especially higher education, their policies and practices are to keep people out rather than to bring people in. We can talk about that in the break. So during my latter years of my tenure as CEO of SAQA, I also started paying attention to how the term credentials and micro-credentials were being defined in the higher education academy. And it spurred me to engage more critically with the uses and definitions of these terminology and what it means for questions of what and whose learning matters and what and whose recognition matters. Now, these visuals I chose very deliberately. The person in the front could be a visual of any agricultural worker in South Africa with no formal education, but the recognition this person has is that he produces microgreens for a high-end market in South Africa. We have this high-end grocery stores, and he's found a niche market there. So he's recognized for the produce that he puts together. The two men there are workers, they are welders. They are known for their craft, they are very recognized, but they have no schooling or learning. But in their communities, they are sought after for their skills and attributes. Both my children are in the creative arts, and I realized that in the creative arts, it doesn't matter how much paper learning you have to audition to get into a philharmonic orchestra, to become an actress on the stage. You have to show what it is you can do. Paper learning only goes so far. In terms of athletes, your ranking is based on winning competitions around the world, not on a piece of paper. You have to show and tell what is it you can do in a competitive environment. So from this, I've gained some interesting insights, which I want to share with you today. And I know I'm preaching to the converted because I've heard your earlier sessions about credentials, but let me share what I saw. So to better understand the term credential, I did a search on Google and found that a credential is defined as a qualification, achievement, quality, or aspect of a person's background, especially when it is used to indicate their suitability for something. I've got that in bold, right? Because suitability for something is how you get recognized. Currently, I found there's no agreed definition of micro-credentials. It's all over the place. And believe me, I was part of a UNESCO group, and I think we were the silent majority where it was captured, I felt. You know, South Africa, we use that term because our past president was captured and sold his soul to the devil. But anyway, it's being captured where it was defined as an assessed, quality-assured, credit-bearing unit of learning. And I think there were some lone voices saying, no, you've got to qualify it. That's related to credit-bearing learning. There is so much other learning that is not linked to assess credits, etc., etc. So what my inquiry has shown me is that in their practice, many education systems have adopted a rather rigid and narrow definition of a credential, which focuses almost exclusively on formally acquired and recognized full qualifications. Even in South Africa, we don't use the term credential. We call it a foreign qualification. Or we always put a qualifier because a credential is more than just a qualification. This oftentimes I found neglects or perhaps intentionally or deliberately fails to recognize and acknowledge other forms of learning attributes and credentials. I have found that many countries in Europe and North America in particular appear to confine their narratives on credentials and micro-credentials on a narrow viewpoint premised on traditional and linear academic educational thinking that only learning which is quality assured, formally assessed and certified as a qualification or credit has merit and deserves consideration. Needless to say, there are others, and so many of us in this room, who hold an alternative view, that qualifications and or credit-bearing learning attributes only reference some of the aspects of a more expansive array of formal, non-formal, and informal credentials and micro-credentials that we accumulate over a lifetime. Dawn, you'll tell me about the time. This view is premised on the reality that while a person's learning journey over a lifetime is cumulative, it is seldom linear. We know from our own personal learning journeys that much of our knowledge and many of our competencies and skills are accumulated more often in haphazard and unintentional ways, I think you said that, through a diverse nexus of formal, non-formal, and self-directed informal learning pathways. The evidence of this is showcased more clearly, and somebody mentioned this earlier, so I'm preaching to the converted, in a person's biography, curriculum vitae, resume, which spotlights not only formal educational achievements, but other notable achievements, competencies, and attributes, leaving the reader to determine suitability for something. In other words, inferring that the recognition of learning and other credentials should be left to the recognizer to determine. So I proceeded to look at how the term recognition is defined and saw that it is described as the perception of something, a knowledge or competence as existing, a fundamental principle. It is the recognition or acknowledgement of something claimed as a valid achievement or entitled for consideration. I find this a compelling argument for notions of recognition to be opened up to beyond qualifications and credits, to considerations and acknowledgements of other kinds of learning. So I just want to remind us, and we know this, so what are some of the key principles of open recognition? And I'll leave you to read that. People come first, people and communities matter, and it should be left to their communities of practice, and some of it is emerging or formalized, and recognition of skills and competencies are connected to a practice. You said that, Serge. So there is no denying that being recognized and acknowledged has a profound and positive impact on most of us, and me included. I was recently appointed Professor of Practice by the University of Johannesburg. I didn't even know those are things that that kind of recognition can happen, because I have not been in the academic space. And must say that this acknowledgement and recognition of my knowledge, experience, and contributions to the advancement of education, training, and social change was very affirming. In this new and rapidly changing world of digital technology, we are being presented with an increasing call for learning programs and curriculum to open out into a range of recognition and acknowledgements of different kinds of learning. There is a demand for shorter, bite-sized learning programs that meet just-in-time skills and competencies. In fact, a few weeks ago, I saw a news article that reported that IT companies are specifically looking to recruit not only people without traditional formal qualifications, but specifically targeting those who are considered neurodivergent in their thinking and ideas. There is specific mention of people who are on the autism spectrum, dyslexic, and who experience other learning challenges in the formal academies of learning, and whose different educational needs have historically been allocated to the periphery of educational provisioning. The question these insights raise for us is, will these new technologies make it easier for individuals to have their varied achievements recognized by end users? Or will the human tendency to go for the most obvious and least bothersome solutions, linked to the somewhat, for me, scary notions of predictive algorithms, lead to new but equally narrow overdependencies? What can we learn from some of the negative outcomes of applied technologies, so that we might identify the potential dangers as well as the potential gains? I will leave that to you to ponder. Just a few more points. In the time I have left, I want to pose a question, a key question, and then share a response. In light of all these points I have raised in my narration, can we honestly say that we are truly putting people at the center when it comes to the assessment and recognition of their knowledge, skills, and other attributes? Or are we sticking to outdated approaches and practices and thereby trying to hammer square pegs into round holes? So let me illustrate my point by using the recognition of or validation of prior learning as an example. As mentioned earlier on, while RPL awards are celebrated as an enabling access tool for the recognition of people's mostly non-formal and informal learning, the assessment approach used for formal recognition award, which is narrow and primarily reliant on the submission of written portfolios of evidence, is still used. I'm not opposed to this, but came to realize that narrow assessment approaches based solely on written evidence does not work for some, including second language learners like refugees and asylum seekers who are not proficient in speaking, reading, and writing in the dominant languages of the countries they find themselves in, or people with low literacy levels, as well as those who live with learning challenges, including dyslexia, autism, and ADHD. And this is based on my recent work on a refugee qualifications recognition project, which involved in-depth interviews to reconstruct a person's qualification and professional history. Becca is in the room, and we did this together. In the absence of paper evidence, we gathered the stories of these highly successful people. And I collected other stories of people without formal qualification who have achieved recognition for their exemplary knowledge, skilled, and applied competencies. And that's how I came to the conclusion that show and tell can become a viable alternative tool to assess and open the recognition of learning. In reflecting on my learning journey, I came to realize that there is a common thread that was widely used in the past to gain recognition, especially by people with no limited formal schooling. I also found that it is a preferred indicator of ability and application of learning in the creative arts, the sporting fields, as I mentioned earlier, and in some practical employment sectors. So I had some anecdotes, but I've run out of time, of people who have used it. I'll do it another time. But a very, very accomplished architect who used biomimicry and did his designs, although he was only trained as a draftsman and he had a school-leaving certificate. And he used biomimicry as the ant as an architect to do his irrigation systems, to build the furrows. He used the termite as an architect to do a cooling system, for his house, so that he, wouldn't increase his carbon footprint and have to use the air conditioner all of the time. He wrote a book about it, and it has illustrations of the weaver bird and all these things from nature that taught him about how to be an architect and be, climate friendly. So let me move on. Last thing. So I'm hoping that I've made a convincing case. As I said, that's why I wrote it down. I could go off in all kinds of tangents. For using show and tell to open recognition, and for the continued development of it as an alternative assessment tool leading to the recognition of learning. So while I leave you to consider that, I just want to share with you one thing that I realized has been an ever-present artifact in my lifelong journey. It is a poster with an African proverb that was given to me in the early 1980s and which has been in my office wall throughout my life. I'm sorry, it's not very clear. But what I see in this graphic is an African academic power broker with tinted glasses facing forward and the back of him surrounded by books and shielding him from the desperate faces looking to him for some answers. So for me, the proverb, until the lions have their historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter, really resonates. Because it has served as a constant reminder throughout my career and learning journey to put people in the center. It also reminded me of the importance of making visible and creating opportunities to hear people's unique voices and to really focus my efforts in acknowledging and recognizing them. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
That's great, thanks. So, thank you. Thank you, Julie. You've met my expectations and beyond. It was worth stalking you. Any questions? Any questions for Julie? Oh.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. This is my first ePIC conference, and I come from the business community, so forgive my naivete. But hearing this presentation and many that came before it, there seems to be this kind of reflexive use of formal and informal. And after hearing this presentation, it almost makes me think, doesn't that kind of handicap the position of open recognition right from the get-go to acknowledge that one is informal and one is formal, that privilege is one over the other. Maybe there's more of a semantic history that I'm aware of, but I'm not saying all things are equal either, but often I'm in positions, and I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow, about where there's a ton of learning that happens on the job that is being left on the table and not recognized. But even when we talk about that in traditional education settings, there's kind of this implicit bias that because it's happening in the workplace, it is less than. And it just got me thinking, sitting here now, actually having some time to think for once. So thank you for putting this conference on. Like, coming at it and saying we're recognizing a dichotomy of formal and informal from the get-go, does that in any way undercut what this movement's trying to do?
So let me make a distinction. Your learning pathway is formal and informal, not recognition. So we dealt with this in looking at RPL in South Africa. And we have an achievement register of all formal qualifications in South Africa. There are about 21 million records of qualifications. Of this, we have about 47 to 50,000 of recognition of prior learning where the pathways were not through the formal academy. So we, in our system, in our database, and this is the very point we are making, because there needs to be parity of esteem. It can't be less than, depending on which pathways you chose, right? So when we issue a qualification certificate after we adjudicate and recognize the qualification, it does not put a disclaimer that says you got it through, you learned it informally and it came through RPL. A qualification is a qualification that you earned and deserved, and it gets recognized. We only capture the data for reporting purposes because RPL is such an important alternative learning pathway for people and to right the wrongs of the past that we recorded to show what developments and improvements we have made in that space. So I hope I answered you.
Okay.
There's some... Andrea. Ah, okay.
I think it's just also important to note that having the opportunity to be assessed for competencies in the workplace is a privilege.
Yeah.
So whether it's through an institution or through a workplace, the opportunity to be assessed in either environment is a very privileged opportunity. So open recognition is an opportunity for people who don't even have that opportunity for assessment. So what you've been speaking to is brilliant because it's this, it's recognition of people who don't even get to be assessed in a formal setting at all.
Yeah.
So this is where we get to see competencies for what they are in like a very holistic and inherent knowledge and traditional practices. And I need to talk to you later.
But one of the points I wanted to make, and Serge and Don, I hope you'll take this up. I think we must locate RPL within a broader frame of open recognition of learning, because it is not only recognition of prior learning, it's recognition of your current learning. I mean, we're learning all the time. So I think that discourse needs to be opened up, and locating RPL as one of the differentiators beyond a broad recognition. And I hope the next VPL Binyale, I think it's in Ireland, right? Yeah. That we start a movement to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Nan Travers will be picking up on that very topic tomorrow, actually. And I think Serge would also say that you can have informal recognition of informal learning also.